The thermometer nailed to the rotting porch beam read 32 degrees below zero. But the wind chill made it feel like the air itself had turned to broken glass, each breath a small act of violence against the lungs. Bryn Holloway pulled her threadbare scarf tighter around her face and squinted into the white void that had swallowed the world. The blizzard had been building for 3 days now, and tonight it had finally shown its teeth. Snow fell so thick and fast that she could barely see the woodpile 10 feet from the cabin door. She was going to die out here. Not tonight, maybe. Not tomorrow. But soon. The math was simple and brutal. She had enough canned beans to last another 2 weeks. Enough firewood for maybe 10 days if she rationed carefully. And the nearest town, a tiny place called Ridgecrest, where the humans didn't know what she was, sat 12 miles down a mountain road that was now buried under 4 feet of fresh powder. No one was coming to save her. No one even knew she existed anymore. Bryn pressed her back against the rough, wooden wall of the cabin and let herself slide down until she was sitting on the frozen porch, her knees pulled up to her chest. The position was familiar. She had spent a lot of time like this over the past 3 months, curled in on herself, trying to take up as little space as possible. Old habits died hard. 3 months ago, Bryn Holloway had been a member of the Silver Pine Pack, one of the oldest and most established packs in the Montana Territory. She had grown up in their compound, played in their forest as a child, eaten at their communal tables. Her father, Thomas Holloway, had been a warrior of considerable reputation before a rogue attack took his life when Bryn was 14. Her mother had died, bringing Bryn into the world, a sacrifice that the pack elders whispered about when they thought Bryn couldn't hear. Cursed from birth, they said. Killed her own mother coming out. Bad blood. Bad luck. But none of that had mattered as much as the simple biological fact that had ultimately sealed her fate. Bryn Holloway was 22 years old and she had never shifted. In the world of werewolves, the wolf spirit was supposed to emerge sometime between a young shifter's 16th and 18th birthday. It was a rite of passage, a biological imperative, the moment when a young wolf truly became whole. The beast that lived inside every member of their kind would rise to the surface, merge with the human consciousness, and grant access to a second form. A form of power, a form of speed and strength, a form of survival. Bryn's wolf had never come. She remembered her 16th birthday with painful clarity. The excitement that had built for months beforehand. The way she had stayed up all night waiting for the change, certain that this was the moment everything would finally make sense. She had felt something stirring inside her, something deep and wild and waiting. But when dawn came, she was still just Bryn, still just human, still just wrong. She had waited through her 17th birthday with growing concern, through her 18th with quiet desperation, through her 19th with the first creeping tendrils of despair. And when her 20th birthday passed without so much as a flicker of the change, the whispers had started in earnest. Defective, broken, cursed. A wolfless Omega was not just unusual. She was a liability, a drain on pack resources, a mouth to feed that could never hunt, a body to protect that could never fight. In the harsh calculus of pack survival, she was dead weight. Alpha Silas Drummond had tolerated her presence for years, partly out of respect for her father's memory, and partly because she had made herself useful in small ways. She cooked, she cleaned, she cared for the pack's children. She did all the invisible labor that kept a community running, asking for nothing in return except a roof over her head and scraps from the table. But tolerance had limits. 3 months ago, on a cold September night, when the first frost was just beginning to silver the ground, Alpha Drummond had finally made his decision. The memory still burned like acid in Bryn's mind. The great hall of the Silver Pine compound, filled with pack members who had known her since childhood. The hard wooden floor beneath her knees as she was forced to kneel before the Alpha's chair. The silence thick and suffocating as Silas Drummond looked down at her with those cold, calculating eyes. "You are a burden," he had said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "A wolfless Omega serves no purpose. You consume resources that could sustain productive members of this pack. You are a weakness we can no longer afford." Bryn had wanted to argue. She had wanted to point out all the ways she contributed, the meals she prepared, the clothes she mended, the children she watched so their parents could hunt. But the words had died in her throat, strangled by the weight of 200 pairs of eyes staring at her with varying degrees of pity and contempt. Leave tonight, Drummond had continued. Take what you can carry. If you are found on Silver Pine territory after dawn, you will be hunted as a trespasser and killed as a rogue. She had not begged. Some small, stubborn part of her had refused to give them that satisfaction. She had simply risen to her feet, walked out of the only home she had ever known, and kept walking until her legs gave out somewhere on the northern border of the neutral lands. That was where she had found the trapper's cabin. It had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. The roof was half caved in on one side. The windows were nothing but empty frames stuffed with rags and old newspapers. The door hung crooked on its hinges and the floorboards creaked ominously with every step. But it had four walls. It had a wood stove that after considerable effort she had managed to get working again. And it was shelter, which was more than she had expected to find. Bryn had taught herself to survive in the months that followed. How to set snares for rabbits, even though her human hands were clumsy and slow. How to identify which roots and berries were safe to eat and which would make her sick. How to ration her dwindling supplies of canned goods from the occasional trip to Ridgecrest. How to melt snow for drinking water without wasting too much precious firewood. How to bank a fire so it would last through the long, frozen nights. She had taught herself to be alone. It was harder than the physical survival in some ways. Wolves were pack animals, even the defective ones. The silence pressed in on her like a physical weight. Sometimes she went days without hearing another voice, and she would catch herself talking to the walls just to remember what sound was like. But she had adapted. She had endured. And she had almost made peace with the idea that this was how she would die. Alone, forgotten in a cabin that nobody knew existed during a winter that nobody would remember. Almost. Bryn pushed herself to her feet with a groan, her joints aching from the cold. She needed to get more firewood before the storm got any worse. The pile on the porch was running low, and if the blizzard continued for another day or two, she would have to start burning furniture again. She had already sacrificed the broken chair in the corner, the table with the wobbly leg, the frame of the cot she slept on, leaving only the thin mattress directly on the floor. Each piece of furniture she burned was a small defeat, a reminder of how precarious her existence truly was. But it was better than freezing to death, marginally. Bryn grabbed the last log from the small pile and was turning back toward the cabin door when something stopped her. A scent. It cut through the clean bite of snow and pine, through the wood smoke from her chimney, through the general numbness that the cold had pressed into her senses. It was sharp and metallic, warm in a way that made her empty stomach clench. Blood, fresh blood, hot blood. The copper tang of it was unmistakable, carried on the wind from somewhere beyond the tree line where the forest grew thick and dark. Every instinct Bryn had screamed at her to ignore it, to go inside, bar the door, and let the storm claim whatever poor creature was bleeding out in the snow. She was not a warrior. She was not a hunter. She was a banished Omega with no wolf and no pack, and getting involved in someone else's problems was a good way to end up dead. But something else was stirring inside her, something deeper than instinct, something that felt almost like a voice, quiet and insistent, telling her that she needed to move, that someone was hurt, that she couldn't just walk away. Bryn dropped the log. She pulled her oversized coat tighter around her thin frame and stepped off the porch into the snow. It came up past her knees immediately, the drifts even deeper than they had been that morning. The wind howled in her ears, trying to push her back, trying to convince her that this was suicide. She kept walking. The tree line was maybe 50 yards from the cabin, though it felt like miles through the heavy snow. Bryn's lungs burned with the cold. Her legs ached with the effort of lifting them high enough to take each step. But the scent of blood was getting stronger, pulling her forward like a hook set deep in her chest. She broke through the first line of trees and into a small clearing, and her heart stopped. He lay in the snow like a fallen king. The wolf was massive, easily the largest she had ever seen. His fur was the color of storm clouds, a deep gray that seemed to shift and shimmer even in the dim light filtering through the blizzard. He was lying on his side, his breathing shallow and labored, his coat matted with blood and ice. Bryn fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his body, unsure where to touch. "Hey," she whispered, her voice nearly lost to the wind. "Can you hear me? Are you alive?" The wolf didn't respond. Frost was already forming on his whiskers. His eyes were closed, and she could see the subtle tremor of hypothermia running through his massive frame. Shifters ran hot. She knew that much. Their supernatural metabolism was supposed to protect them from cold that would kill an ordinary human in minutes. But whatever had happened to this wolf, whatever had left him bleeding and broken in the snow, had clearly drained him of that protection. Bryn looked up, hoping to find some sign of how he had gotten here. Tracks in the snow, a trail she could follow. Something that would explain what she was looking at. Instead, she found more bodies. They were scattered across the clearing like soldiers fallen on a battlefield, like autumn leaves blown from a dying tree. She counted them with growing horror, her eyes jumping from one massive form to the next. 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 11. 11 wolves in total, each one massive, each one bleeding, each one dying. Bryn rose to her feet on legs that threatened to buckle beneath her. She moved through the carnage in a daze, checking each body for signs of life. They were breathing. All of them were still breathing, but barely. Their wounds were strange, clean entry points that looked almost like bullet holes, and from each wound seeped a thick, viscous fluid that she recognized instantly. Wolfsbane. The acrid chemical stench of it hit her like a fist to the face, making her eyes water. Wolfsbane was a poison specifically designed to target shifters. In small doses, it caused weakness and disorientation. In larger doses, it prevented them from accessing their wolf forms, sapped their supernatural healing abilities, and most dangerously of all, drained the heat from their bodies. These wolves hadn't just been attacked. They had been hunted, ambushed with military precision, and left to freeze to death in the storm. If Bryn left them here, they would all be dead within the hour. She looked at her thin arms. She looked at the massive bodies scattered around her. She did the math and felt despair wash over her like a wave. "I can't do this," she said aloud, her voice cracking. "I can't carry them. I'm just a human. I'm not strong enough." But even as the words left her mouth, her feet were already moving. She was walking toward the center of the clearing, toward a shape she had noticed, but not fully processed until now. A wolf that made all the others look like puppies. He was enormous, easily twice the size of the gray wolf she had found first maybe 3 times. His fur was the color of midnight, so black it seemed to absorb what little light filtered through the storm clouds. Even unconscious, even dying, he radiated a presence that made the air feel heavy, that made Bryn's instincts scream at her to run. She didn't run. She walked closer, her boots crunching through the frozen crust of snow, until she was standing directly over him. Up close, she could see the damage more clearly. A deep gash along his flank still steaming faintly in the cold air. Smaller wounds on his shoulder and leg, and everywhere that acrid black seepage of wolfsbane. He should have been dead. By all logic, by all reason, a wolf this badly injured should have succumbed to the poison hours ago. But his chest was still rising and falling, slowly, stubbornly clinging to life, with a tenacity that seemed almost supernatural. No, Bryn realized, not almost, actually supernatural. She didn't know who he was, she didn't know what he was, but she could feel something radiating from him even now, even on the edge of death. A power that went beyond mere physical strength, an authority that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality around him. And she felt something else too, something strange and inexplicable. A thrumming vibration in her chest like a tuning fork struck in the depths of her soul. A pulling sensation, magnetic and irresistible, drawing her toward this fallen king of shadows. She didn't understand it. She couldn't explain it. But she knew with a certainty that went beyond logic or reason that she was not going to let him die. "I don't care if it kills me," Bryn whispered, her voice fierce despite the chattering of her teeth. "I'm not leaving any of you here." She turned and ran back toward the cabin, her legs burning with the effort of fighting through the snow. She needed supplies, equipment, something to help her move 11 massive wolves across 50 yards of frozen wilderness. She burst through the cabin door and looked around desperately. Her eyes fell on the old tarp she used to cover the leak in the roof, now rolled up in the corner. A coil of rope that had been left behind by whatever trapper had once called this place home. A pair of leather work gloves, cracked with age but still serviceable. It wasn't much. It would have to be enough. The next 3 hours were the hardest of Bryn Holloway's life. She started with the smallest wolf, a russet-furred female who looked almost delicate compared to the others. Delicate was relative, of course. Even the smallest of them probably weighed 200 pounds with teeth as long as Bryn's fingers and claws that could gut a deer in a single swipe. But she was the lightest, and Bryn needed to pace herself. She rolled the russet wolf onto the tarp, the effort making her arms burn and her back scream in protest. She wrapped the rope around her own waist, forming a crude harness. She dug her boots into the ice, and she pulled. The wolf moved an inch. Bryn gritted her teeth and pulled harder. Her boots slipped. She felt her hips slamming into a buried rock. Pain lanced up her side, but she ignored it. She got back up. She repositioned herself. She pulled again. Inch by inch, foot by foot, yard by agonizing yard, she dragged the russet wolf out of the clearing and through the tree line, past the woodpile and up the creaking steps of the porch, through the cabin door and onto the worn wooden floor. By the time she got the first wolf inside, Bryn was drenched in sweat despite the freezing temperature. Her arms were shaking so badly she could barely grip the rope. Her breath came in ragged gasps that stabbed at her lungs. And she had 10 more to go. She didn't rest. She couldn't afford to rest. She ran back out into the storm and found the next wolf. A brown male with a notched ear, probably from some long-ago battle. She got him onto the tarp and started pulling. One by one, she brought them in. The gray wolf who had first caught her attention. A white wolf with blood crusted around his muzzle. A pair of brothers or so, she assumed from the similarity of their coloring, their fur the same shade of dark brown, their wounds nearly identical. 3, 4, 5. Her hands started bleeding inside her gloves, the skin rubbing raw against the rough rope. She ignored it. 6, 7, 8. She stopped feeling her toes somewhere around the ninth wolf, the numbness spreading up from her feet until her whole lower body felt like it belonged to someone else. She ignored that too. 9, 10. When she dragged the 10th wolf across the threshold of the cabin, Bryn collapsed against the door frame and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of rest. She slumped there, chest-heaving visions swimming every muscle in her body, begging her to stop. But the black wolf was still out there, the biggest one, the one whose presence she could still feel pulling at something deep in her chest like a hook set in her soul. She pushed herself back to her feet. She stumbled out into the storm one last time. The black wolf lay where she had left him, a mountain of dark fur, half buried in fresh snow. The wind had picked up even more since she started howling through the trees with a fury that seemed almost personal. Visibility was down to nearly nothing. But she found him anyway. She would have found him in complete darkness, guided by nothing but that strange, inexplicable pull. Bryn fell to her knees beside him and pressed her hand against his chest, feeling for a heartbeat. It was there, faint but steady, a drumbeat of stubborn life that refused to be silenced. "Okay, big guy," she breathed. "Last one, you're the last one. Just work with me here." She wrestled the tarp under his massive body, a task that took nearly 15 minutes of struggling and straining. He was so heavy, impossibly heavy, like trying to move a boulder made of muscle in midnight. When she finally got him positioned and wrapped the rope around her waist, she knew this was going to be different. The other wolves had been hard. This one was going to be nearly impossible. She dug her heels into the ice and pulled. He moved an inch. She cried out in frustration, her voice swallowed by the wind, and pulled again. Another inch. Tears of exhaustion and desperation froze on her cheeks. Her lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to stop, to give up, to accept that some things were simply beyond her ability. But she kept pulling. "I don't know who you are," she gasped, the words coming out in ragged bursts between her efforts. "I don't know what you are, but I don't think you're the type to give up easily. So I'm not giving up on you. Come on, please, help me help you." She didn't expect a response. He was unconscious. Dying couldn't possibly hear her. But something shifted. The weight on the rope lightened just slightly, just enough to reduce the friction by a fraction, as if somewhere deep in that massive body, some part of him was still awake, still fighting, still trying to survive. Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe she was delirious from exhaustion and cold and the impossible exertion of the past 3 hours. But it felt like he was helping her, inch by inch, foot by foot, yard by agonizing yard. Bryn dragged the black wolf across the clearing and through the tree line, past the woodpile and up the creaking steps of the porch. The door was still open from her last trip, the heat from the cabin spilling out into the frozen night. She gave one final heave, putting every last ounce of strength she had left into the effort. And the black wolf slid across the threshold just as the storm reached its absolute crescendo, the wind shrieking like a living thing. Bryn kicked the door shut and collapsed on the floor beside him. For a long moment, she just lay there staring up at the water-stained ceiling of the cabin. The sound of the wind outside was muffled, now reduced to a distant howl. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the dying fire and the ragged breathing of 12 living creatures packed into a space meant for one. She had done it. She didn't know how. She didn't know where the strength had come from, but she had dragged 11 giant wolves through a blizzard and into her tiny cabin. And now she realized with growing horror she had to keep them alive. The cabin was chaos. 11 massive wolves took up almost every square inch of floor space. They were piled practically on top of each other. Wet fur pressed against wet fur, blood mixing with melted snow and dark puddles on the worn wooden boards. The smell was overwhelming, copper and musk and the acrid chemical stench of wolfsbane. Bryn forced herself to her feet, ignoring the screaming protest of her exhausted muscles. The fire was dying, the carefully banked coals from that morning now fading to gray ash. If she let it go out, all her work would be for nothing. She stumbled to the wood stove and threw in every last log she had stockpiled. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, to heat a room packed with hypothermic bodies. She looked around desperately, and her eyes fell on the remaining furniture. The small wooden shelf where she kept her canned goods, the frame of the mirror she had salvaged from the wreckage of the original cabin, the boards she had been saving to repair the hole in the wall. She fed them all into the flames. Within an hour, she had burned nearly everything flammable in the cabin that wasn't structural, but the cast iron stove was glowing orange, now radiating heat like a small sun. The temperature in the room was finally starting to rise. Now came the harder part. Bryn grabbed her buckets of snow, the ones she kept by the door for melting into drinking water, and set them on the stove to heat. While the water warmed, she gathered every rag and scrap of cloth she could find. Old shirts too worn to wear, a towel with holes in it, the curtains she had hung over the windows to block the draft. She started with the black wolf. Up close, lying in the flickering firelight, he was even more magnificent and terrifying than he had seemed in the clearing. His paws were the size of dinner plates. His fangs, visible where his lips had pulled back an unconscious grimace, were as long as her fingers. Even lying on his side, barely breathing, he radiated power that made her primitive hindbrain want to flee. Omega instincts, she knew. The biological programming that made her want to submit to any alpha she encountered. But something about this wolf was different. The pressure she felt from him wasn't just alpha energy. It was something more, something older, something that felt less like dominance and more like gravity. She pushed the feeling aside and got to work. The wound on his flank was ugly, a clean entry point, definitely from a wolfsbane round, with that black poison still seeping sluggishly from the puncture. She dipped a rag in the warm water and began to clean it, wiping away the blood and the poison with careful, methodical strokes. She was so focused on her work that she didn't notice his eye open. She didn't see the iris bright as molten gold fix on her face with laser intensity. She was reaching for a fresh rag when a sound stopped her cold. A low rumble, deep and powerful. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the floorboards and up into her bones. Bryn froze. Her hand hovered over the wound. Her heart stopped beating. Slowly terrified of what she might see, she looked up. The black wolf was awake. His eye, the one she could see, was fully open and completely lucid. There was no confusion in that burning gaze. No disorientation. No weakness. He was looking at her with the sharp, calculating awareness of a predator assessing potential prey, or a king assessing a subject. The pressure in the room intensified until Bryn could barely breathe. Every Omega instinct she possessed screamed at her to bare her throat, to submit, to grovel, before the overwhelming authority of the creature in front of her. Instead, she forced herself to speak. "I'm helping you." Her voice came out as barely a whisper, trembling, despite her best efforts to control it. "You have wolfsbane in your system. I'm cleaning it out. Please. I'm not going to hurt you." The black wolf stared at her. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Bryn could feel his gaze moving over her face, reading her like a book written in fear and exhaustion and desperate determination. She could feel him taking in her scent, that subtle chemical language that all shifters could interpret. Fear, exhaustion, lavender from the soap she made herself. And underneath it all, the faint sweetness that marked her as an Omega. A wolfless Omega. A banished Omega. A nobody. But she had dragged him through a blizzard. She had burned her furniture to keep him warm. She was kneeling beside him with bloody hands and stubborn hope in her eyes. The black wolf let out a huff of air that might have been a sigh. His eye closed again. His massive body relaxed against the floor. Permission granted. Bryn let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the rag, but she went back to work anyway. She cleaned his wound first, then moved on to the next wolf, and the next, and the next. She worked her way through all 11 of them, washing away blood and poison, checking for broken bones, doing everything she could with her limited supplies and complete lack of medical training. The gray wolf had a gash on his shoulder that wouldn't stop bleeding. She tore strips from her only remaining shirt and bound it as tightly as she dared. The russet female had a wound dangerously close to her throat. Bryn cleaned it with extra care, terrified that one wrong move would open an artery. The white wolf's injuries seemed to be mostly internal. She couldn't see anything obviously wrong, but his breathing was more labored than the others. All she could do was keep him warm and hope. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, Bryn found an old pot and filled it with water, the bones from her last rabbit catch, and a handful of dried herbs she had gathered in the fall. It wasn't much of a broth, but it was warm and it had nutrients. She went to each wolf, who seemed conscious enough to swallow, and carefully poured small amounts of the liquid into their mouths. Most of them took it without resistance. A few even seemed to lean into her touch, their massive heads pressing against her hands, with something that felt almost like gratitude. By 4 in the morning, Bryn was running on fumes. She had done everything she could. The fire was roaring, the wounds were cleaned, the wolves were warm and fed. Now all she could do was wait and hope that their supernatural healing would kick in before the poison finished its work. She looked around the cabin for somewhere to rest and almost laughed at the absurdity. There was no room. The wolves had taken up every inch of floor space. The only furniture left was a single wooden stool that she had saved because it was too small to be worth burning. Her eyes fell on the black wolf. He was lying near the center of the room, his massive body rising and falling with steady breaths. The other wolves had arranged themselves around him in a protective formation, even in their unconscious state, recognizing him as someone important, someone to be protected. And heat was radiating from his dark fur like warmth from a furnace. The wolfsbane was working its way out of his system, and his supernatural metabolism was starting to recover. Bryn was so tired she could barely see straight, so cold that her body had stopped shivering, which she knew was a bad sign. She needed warmth. She needed rest. Before she could talk herself out of it, she curled up on the floor next to the black wolf and pressed her back against his massive spine. He was warm, so impossibly warm, like lying next to a bonfire wrapped in the softest furs she had ever felt. She didn't know who these wolves were. She didn't know what they had been doing on her mountain or who had attacked them. She didn't know that the Silver Pine Pack who had banished her was currently hunting these very wolves for a bounty offered by a group called the Northern Alliance. She didn't know that the massive black wolf she was using as a pillow was Kyle Thornwood, the Alpha King of the entire North American continent, ruler of every pack from the Atlantic to the Pacific. She just knew that she was tired, and he was warm, and for the first time in 3 months, pressed against the back of a stranger who could kill her with a single snap of his jaws. She felt almost safe. Bryn closed her eyes and fell into the deepest sleep of her life. Cale Thornwood was awake. He had been awake for hours ever since the strange little Omega had first pressed a warm rag to his wound, but he hadn't moved a muscle. Hadn't opened his eyes more than that single time when he needed to assess whether she was a threat. Now he lay perfectly still, feeling the warmth of her small body against his back, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing, and trying to process what had happened. His memories of the ambush were fragmented, sharp flashes of chaos and pain disconnected from any coherent timeline. He remembered the mountain road, the routine patrol that was supposed to be nothing more than a show of presence in the Northern Territories. He remembered the first shot, the whine of the wolfsbane round cutting through the air, the burning agony as the poison entered his bloodstream. He remembered his men falling around him one by one, Roan and his Gamma taking 3 rounds to the chest before going down, Beckett, his Beta, trying to rally the others before a shot to the leg brought him to his knees. The newer members of the Vanguard men he had personally selected and trained, dropping like flies as the ambush closed around them. It had been a trap, a perfectly executed trap with military-grade wolfsbane ammunition and jamming devices that had cut off their communications before they could call for backup. Someone had known their route. Someone had known their timing. Someone had sold them out. The Northern Alliance, a coalition of rebel packs who had been growing in power for the past decade, unified by their hatred of the monarchy and their belief that the old ways were better. They had been a nuisance for years, occasional skirmishes and political maneuvering, nothing that posed a real threat to the throne. This ambush changed everything. Kyle remembered forcing himself into his wolf form as the poison took hold, a last desperate defense against the cold that was already seeping into his bones. He remembered the world going gray at the edges, the snow swallowing him, the certainty, cold and absolute, that this frozen clearing would be his grave. He had expected to wake up in whatever afterlife awaited kings who had failed their people. Instead, he had woken up in a room that smelled like wood smoke and vanilla, with a tiny Omega cleaning the poison from his wounds. Carefully, without disturbing the girl sleeping against his back, KO cracked his eye open and surveyed his surroundings. The cabin was small, pathetically small, barely larger than the closet where he kept his formal robes back at the Obsidian Palace, Ramon. The walls were rough-hewn logs, gaps visible between them where the chinking had failed. The roof sagged ominously in one corner. The floor was worn smooth by decades of use, and the furniture, what little remained of it, looked like it belonged in a museum of poverty. But his men were here. All 10 members of his elite guard, the Vanguard, were arranged around the room in various states of recovery. He could see Ronan breathing steadily to his left, his gray fur matted, but his wounds already starting to close. Beckett was near the door, his ears twitching at every sound, clearly on the edge of consciousness and ready to respond to any threat. They were alive. All of them were alive. Because of her. Kale turned his attention to the girl pressed against his back. She was small, far too thin, her ribs visible, even through the layers of worn clothing she wore. Her hair was a tangled mess of chestnut brown, and her face, even in sleep, carried the marks of chronic exhaustion and old suffering. Her hands, he noticed, were bandaged with strips of fabric that were already seeping red. She had hurt herself, saving them. He inhaled deeply, taking in her scent with all the sensitivity his wolf senses could muster. Omega. Definitely Omega, with the sweet undertone that marked her kind. Lavender and vanilla, probably from whatever crude soap she made herself. Exhaustion. Pain. Fear that had faded to a background hum. And something else. Something sour and bitter that he recognized from years of experience reading the chemical stories that every wolf carried in their scent. Suffering. Long-term suffering, the kind that seeped into the bones and never fully left. This girl had been through hell long before tonight, and yet she had saved them. KL replayed the fragmentary memories he had of the night, her voice talking to him as she dragged his massive body through the snow. Come on, please, help me help you. The feeling of her small hands cleaning his wounds with desperate efficiency, the sound of her breaking apart furniture to feed the fire, the warmth of the broth she had carefully poured into his mouth, not knowing if he was conscious enough to swallow. She had done all of that, alone, without any supernatural strength or speed, without any pack to support her, without any obligation to help. She had simply seen creatures in need and refused to let them die. Something stirred in the depths of Kael's consciousness. His wolf, the beast that lived inside every shifter, suddenly rose to attention. Not with the aggression that usually marked its awakening, not with the territorial fury that had made Kale one of the most feared alphas in history, with something else entirely. Recognition. Mate. The word echoed through Kale's mind like a bell struck in a silent cathedral. It reverberated through every fiber of his being, shaking loose certainties he had held for over a century. Mate, mate, mate. His wolf was purring, actually purring like some oversized house cat, completely content just to have this strange girl's back pressed against its fur. In 147 years of life, Kale Thornwood had never felt anything like it. He had met beautiful women, powerful women, daughters of alphas and leaders of their own packs, women who would have killed for the chance to stand at his side. He had taken lovers when the need arose, always careful to keep his heart locked away, always knowing that attachment was a weakness he couldn't afford. But he had never found his mate. Never felt the legendary bond that was supposed to snap into place when two souls recognized each other across time and space. He had begun to believe that he simply didn't have one, that the moon goddess had looked at him, seen the darkness and the violence and the weight of all the blood on his hands, and decided he didn't deserve that kind of connection. And now here, in a rotting cabin in the middle of nowhere covered in wolfsbane and barely alive, he had found her. His mate was a wolfless Omega, a banished Omega, a girl so broken by the world that she was living in a shack and surviving on canned beans and stubbornness. The irony was not lost on him. Neither was the overwhelming surge of protectiveness that flooded through him, so powerful it nearly forced him to shift right there on the floor. He wanted to wrap himself around her. He wanted to hunt down everyone who had ever hurt her and tear them apart with his bare teeth. He wanted to carry her back to the obsidian palace and lock her in the safest room in the kingdom where nothing could ever touch her again. But the wolfsbane was still in his system. Shifting now would be agonizing and the noise would wake her. She needed rest. She had earned rest. So instead, he simply lay there feeling her breathe against his back and made a silent vow. Whoever had hurt her, whoever had broken her, whoever had thrown this precious creature out into the cold to die, he was going to find them. And he was going to make them wish they had never been born. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. Something had changed. An invisible thread was weaving itself between two souls, connecting them in ways neither fully understood. The Alphaking and the banished Omega, the monster and the maiden, the beginning of a story that would reshape a kingdom. Neither of them knew it yet, but by morning everything would be different. The gray light of dawn is just beginning to filter through the gaps in the cabin walls when Bryn finally stirred. For a moment, suspended in that hazy space between sleep and waking, she didn't remember where she was. The warmth against her back was so perfect, so complete that she thought she must still be dreaming. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt this safe. Then reality crashed back in and she sat up gasping. The wolves, they were still there. All 11 of them filling every inch of her tiny cabin with fur and muscle and the lingering scent of blood and healing. But something had changed. They looked better. Their breathing was deeper, steadier, less labored. Several of them had shifted positions during the night, their wounds visibly smaller than they had been hours ago. The wolfsbane was wearing off. Their supernatural healing was kicking in. Bryn let out a breath of relief so profound it made her dizzy. She had actually done it. She had kept them alive long enough for their bodies to take over. Now they just needed rest and food and warmth, and they would recover. She was about to push herself to her feet when a sound from outside made her freeze. An engine. The rumble of a vehicle engine cutting through the howl of the storm. Bryn's blood turned to ice. She scrambled to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wiped away the frost that had formed on the inside of the glass and peered out into the gray morning light. Through the still falling snow, she could just make out the shape of a truck bouncing up the mountain road. A big truck, a black truck, with a symbol painted on the door that she recognized instantly. The Silver Pine Pack. No, she whispered, her voice cracking with fear. No, no, no. She knew that truck. She knew who drove it, and she knew exactly why they were here. They had followed the blood trail. The same trail she had followed last night, the one that led from the clearing where the wolves had fallen straight to her cabin door. And now they were coming to finish what the ambush had started. Bryn spun away from the window and looked at the wolves with desperate eyes. They were recovering, yes, but they weren't recovered. They were still weak, still sluggish, still vulnerable. If Silver Pine found them like this, she didn't let herself finish the thought. You have to stay quiet, she hissed, moving through the room and touching each wolf gently, even though she knew they probably couldn't understand her. Please, don't move. Don't make a sound. She grabbed the oversized coat that hung by the door, the one that had belonged to whoever used to live here before, and threw it on. It swallowed her thin frame, making her look even smaller than she was. She took one last look at the black wolf lying still and silent in the center of the room. His eyes were closed, but she had the strangest feeling that he was watching her anyway, that he was aware of everything happening around him. Stay hidden, she whispered to him. Please. Then she opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit her like a physical blow after the warmth of the cabin. The storm had died down somewhat overnight, but the wind was still bitter and the temperature hadn't climbed above zero. Her breath plumed white in the gray morning air. 3 figures were climbing out of the truck. She recognized the one in front immediately. Thane. He was one of Alpha Drummond's enforcers, a cruel man with a cruel smile who had taken particular pleasure in tormenting her during her years in the pack. He was big, muscular in the way of a brawler rather than a warrior, and absolutely convinced that his position gave him the right to do whatever he wanted to, whoever he wanted. The two wolves behind him were younger, lower-ranked enforcers in training who followed Thane around like dogs hoping for scraps. Well, 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 Thane said, a grin spreading across his face as he approached the porch. Look what we have here. The little runt is still alive. Bryn forced herself to stand straight, to meet his eyes without flinching. It went against every Omega instinct she had, but she refused to cower in front of him. What do you want, Thane? He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her with amused contempt. He was enjoying this, she realized, enjoying the power he had over her. Alpha Drummond sent us on patrol, he said. We're tracking a blood trail. Interesting thing, it leads right to your doorstep. He tilted his head, sniffing the air with exaggerated interest. Smells like you've been busy. What are you hiding in that little shack, runt? Bryn's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it, but she kept her voice steady. I caught a deer, dragged it back before the storm hit. Thane laughed. The sound was ugly, mocking. A deer. In this storm. He shook his head, still grinning. You couldn't catch a cold, you useless waste of space. Everyone knows you're defective, wolfless, worthless. He started up the steps and Bryn moved to block the door. This is neutral territory, she said. Her voice found a shred of steel she didn't know she possessed. You banished me. You have no jurisdiction here. No right to enter my home. Thane stopped. His grin faded into something uglier. Something dangerous. I have the right, he growled, his voice dropping to a threatening rumble, to do whatever I want to a masterless Omega. You're not part of any pack run. You have no protection, no alpha to hide behind, no laws that apply. He took another step closer, close enough that she could smell his breath, close enough that she could see the cruel anticipation in his eyes. Now open the door, Bryn. Let us see what you're hiding, or I'll open it myself and I won't be gentle about it. No, the word came out before she could stop it, a single syllable of defiance that surprised them both. Thane's face twisted with rage. The next few seconds happened very fast. His hand shot out, grabbing her by the throat and slamming her back against the wall of the cabin. The impact drove the air from her lungs. His fingers tightened, not quite cutting off her breath, but making it very clear that he could. Maybe I'll take my payment in trade, he snarled, his face inches from hers. Since you don't have any money or anything else worth taking, though I can think of one or two things a defective little Omega might still be good for. Fear flooded through Bryn. Real fear. The kind she had almost forgotten how to feel in the months of lonely survival. This was different from the cold, different from the hunger. This was the fear of being helpless in the hands of someone who wanted to hurt her. Inside the cabin, something stirred. A sound began, low at first, so low it was almost below the threshold of human hearing. A rumble that seemed to come from the very foundations of the earth. It built steadily, growing louder, growing closer until the porch boards began to vibrate beneath their feet. Thane didn't notice at first. He was too focused on Bryn, too caught up in his own cruelty. But the two enforcers behind him noticed. Their faces went pale. Their eyes went wide. Thane, one of them said, his voice shaking. Thane, something's wrong. Shut up, Thane snapped, not taking his eyes off Bryn. I'm busy. The rumble grew louder. The cabin itself seemed to shudder. Inside, something was moving, something massive. And then the world exploded. The door didn't open. It detonated. Wood splinters flew through the air like shrapnel. The hinges tore free from the frame with a shriek of tortured metal. The door itself rocketed off the porch and into the snow 20 feet away. And through the opening came a nightmare. The Black Wolf. He was standing now fully upright, and Bryn finally understood just how enormous he truly was. Even on all fours, his shoulders reached nearly to her chin. His midnight fur seemed to absorb the gray morning light, making him look less like a wolf and more like a hole cut in the fabric of reality. His eyes blazed with golden fire, ancient and terrible, and absolutely merciless. And he was looking at Thane with an expression of such pure, concentrated murder that even Bryn, pressed against the wall with Thane's hand still around her throat, felt a spike of primal terror. Behind the Black Wolf, the other 10 wolves were rising. Their wounds weren't fully healed. Their strength wasn't fully returned. But they were awake now, and they were angry, and they were ready to kill. Thane released Bryn like she had burned him. He stumbled backward, nearly falling down the porch steps, his face a mask of absolute horror. All the arrogance, all the cruelty, all the smug certainty of his own power, it was gone, replaced by the wide-eyed terror of a man who had just realized he was prey. "What the hell?" he breathed. "What the hell are you?" The black wolf stepped out onto the porch. The wood groaned beneath his weight. Steam rose from his dark fur into the frozen air. His body heat so intense that snow sizzled where it touched him. He looked at Thane. He looked at the hand that had been wrapped around Bryn's throat. And he moved. The attack was so fast that Bryn barely saw it. One moment the black wolf was standing on the porch. The next his jaws were clamped around Thane's forearm, and the sound of breaking bone echoed across the clearing like a gunshot. Thane screamed, a high piercing sound of pure agony that seemed to go on forever. He dropped to his knees in the snow, his arms still locked in those massive jaws, blood spraying across the white ground. The black wolf released him with a contemptuous flick of his head, sending Thane sprawling in the snow. The other two enforcers had shifted their russet and brown wolf forms, crouching in the snow, trying to decide whether to attack or flee. It was a mistake to hesitate. The rest of the vanguard poured out of the cabin like a wave of fur and fangs. Ronan the big gray wolf slammed into one of the enforcers and sent him flying off the porch and into a deep snowdrift. Two others surrounded the second enforcer before he could even bare his teeth, their lips pulled back in silent snarls that promised death. Within seconds, it was over. Thane was sobbing in the snow, clutching his shattered arm to his chest. The two enforcers were pinned down, whimpering, utterly defeated. And the black wolf was stalking toward Thane with murder in his eyes. "Please," Thane whimpered. "Please, I didn't know. I didn't know they were yours. I didn't know she was protected. Please don't kill me." The black wolf stopped. He stood over Thane's crumpled form, those ancient amber eyes burning with cold fury. And then something impossible happened. Bones cracked. Fur receded. The massive black wolf blurred and shifted his form, flowing like water, reforming into something new. When the transformation was complete, a man stood in the snow. He was tall, enormously tall, easily 6'5", with shoulders broad enough to block out the weak winter sun. His body was a map of old scars, each one telling a story of battles fought and survived. His hair was as black as his wolf's fur, wet with melted snow, hanging over eyes that still blazed with that terrifying golden fire. He was also completely naked, steam rising from his skin into the freezing air, and he was looking down at Thane with an expression of cold, absolute judgment. Thane stared up at him. Recognition slowly dawned on his face, draining the blood from his features until he was white as the snow beneath him. "The king," he choked out. You're the Alphaking." The man's voice when he spoke was deep and resonant, carrying an authority that seemed to bend reality itself. "Run." A single word, but it carried the weight of a death sentence delayed, not commuted. "Go back to your Alpha. Tell Silas Drummond that if any wolf from Silver Pine Pack steps 1 foot near this cabin again, I will burn his territory to ashes. I will salt the earth where his pack house stands. I will erase his bloodline from history so completely that no one will even remember he existed." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice dropped to something even more terrible than a shout. "And if I ever see your face again, I will make what I did to your arm look like a gentle warning." Thane didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet, shifting clumsily into his wolf form, despite his shattered arm, and fled toward the truck. The other two enforcers followed their tails between their legs, their earlier arrogance completely forgotten. Within moments, the sound of the engine faded into the distance, swallowed by the endless white of the storm. Silence fell over the clearing. Bryn stood pressed against the wall of the cabin, her heart hammering, her mind racing, trying to process what she had just witnessed. The Alpha King. She knew that name. Everyone knew that name. Cale Thornwood, ruler of all the packs in North America, master of the Obsidian Palace, the most powerful werewolf on the entire continent. His face was known to every wolf from coast to coast. His reputation preceded him like a thunderstorm, and she had made him drink broth from a dirty pot. She had used him as a pillow. Oh, God. The man turned to face her. The rage drained from his face, replaced by something else. Something that looked almost like concern, almost like tenderness. He walked toward her, ignoring the cold, ignoring the snow melting against his bare skin. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he was approaching a frightened animal. Bryn tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. She was already against the wall. I didn't know, she stammered, her eyes fixed on the ground because Omega instincts made it impossible to meet his gaze. I didn't know who you were. I thought you were just hurt wolves. I'm sorry. I didn't have permission. Please. Please don't hurt me. The man stopped. For a long moment he just stood there, and Bryn could feel the weight of his gaze on the top of her bowed head. Then slowly, carefully, he knelt in the snow. He knelt until his eyes were level with hers, until she could see him without having to look up, until the power differential between them was at least symbolically erased. Bryn, he said softly. She flinched. How did he know her name? Look at me, he said. She couldn't. Every instinct screamed at her that meeting an Alpha King's eyes was suicide. Please, he said, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. A gentleness, a vulnerability. Please, Bryn, look at me. Slowly trembling, she raised her eyes. The golden gaze that met hers wasn't angry. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't filled with the contempt she had come to expect from anyone with power over her. It was looking at her with something that almost resembled wonder. You saved us, he said. You pulled 11 of my finest warriors from death's frozen grip. You cleaned poison from my blood. You stood between them and armed enemies with nothing but your own courage. His hand rose, hovering near her cheek, not quite touching. I would sooner rip out my own heart than hurt you. Bryn stared at him, at this impossible man who had appeared out of nowhere and turned her world upside down. I don't understand, she whispered. Why would the Alpha King care about a wolfless Omega? Something flickered in those ancient amber eyes, something deep and fierce and utterly sincere. Because you're not just any Omega, he said quietly, and you're not wolfless. Not really. You've just been waiting. Waiting for someone strong enough to wake what's sleeping inside you. He rose to his feet, and despite his nakedness, despite the cold, he carried himself with the absolute authority of a king. From the porch, one of the other wolves, now shifted into human form, threw a blanket down. The Alpha King caught it and wrapped it around his waist, though he seemed almost annoyed at the necessity. Then, without warning, he bent and scooped Bryn into his arms. She gasped, her hands pushing weakly against his chest, which felt like pushing against warm granite. I can walk, she protested. Humor me, he rumbled against her ear. He carried her toward the cabin, stepping over the shattered remains of the door. You need to go to a hospital, Bryn said, eyeing the wound on his side that was still sluggishly seeping. You're still injured. I'm healing, he said, and you're freezing. He set her down on the wooden stool, the only piece of furniture left standing, and turned to his men. Ronan, he barked, secure the perimeter. Beckett, get the emergency comm working. I want extraction in 2 hours. Yes, my king, came the immediate response from multiple throats. Bryn watched in a daze as a dozen naked men moved around her tiny cabin with military precision. They were all huge, all scarred, all radiating the kind of power that made her want to curl into a ball and hide. But none of them looked at her with anything other than respect. Some even nodded in her direction as they passed, a gesture of acknowledgement that no one had ever given her before. The Alpha King turned back to her. He had found one of her old blankets and draped it over his shoulders like a cape, which somehow only made him look more regal. What is your name, he asked. Your full name. Bryn Holloway. Bryn Holloway, he repeated as if tasting the words. And how did you come to be living in a shack in the middle of nowhere? Bryn Holloway. She hesitated, but something about his gaze made her want to tell the truth. Made her feel like maybe for the first time in her life, the truth wouldn't be used against her. I was banished, she said quietly, from the Silver Pine Pack. 3 months ago. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Banished, the Alpha King repeated, his voice dangerously soft. Why? Bryn looked at her hands. They were still wrapped in bloody bandages, still aching from the night's exertions. Because I couldn't shift. My wolf never came. In Silver Pine, if you don't shift by 18, you're considered defective. A drain on resources. Alpha Drummond said I was bad luck. She forced herself to meet his eyes. So he kicked me out, told me to leave or be hunted. I chose to leave. The Alpha King was very still. the kind of stillness that preceded violence. "You saved my life," he said slowly. "You saved the lives of 10 of my best warriors. You did it alone in the middle of a blizzard with no supernatural abilities and no weapons." He stepped closer, and Bryn could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You have more wolf in you than that entire pack," combined Bryn Holloway. "Never let anyone tell you otherwise." Before she could respond, before she could process what he had said, a sound filled the air from outside, the rhythmic beating of helicopter blades. The Alpha King turned toward the window. "That's our extraction," he said. He looked back at Bryn, those burning amber eyes intense. "I'm going to ask you a question, Bryn, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." "Okay," she whispered. "Come with me." "What?" "Come with me to the Obsidian Palace. Let me take you somewhere safe, somewhere warm, somewhere that Silas Drummond can never touch you again." Bryn's mind reeled. "I can't. I'm a banished Omega. I can't go to the palace. I'm nobody." The Alpha King reached out and gently, so gently, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You are the woman who saved a king," he said quietly. "And as of this moment, you are under my personal protection. Anyone who wants to touch you will have to go through me, through my vanguard, through an army." He paused, those ancient eyes searching hers. Besides, he added a hint of something dark and satisfied in his voice. "We have a score to settle with Alpha Drummond, and I prefer to settle my debts with an audience." Bryn looked around her tiny cabin, at the broken door, at the bare walls, at the pathetic remnants of her lonely existence. Then she looked at Cale Thornwood, Alpha King of North America, who was watching her with an intensity that made her soul tremble. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll come with you." Something flickered across his face, something that looked almost like relief, almost like joy. He held out his hand. And Bryn Holloway, the wolfless Omega, the cursed girl, the nobody who had been thrown away by everyone who should have loved her, placed her hand in his. Outside, the helicopter's searchlights cut through the thinning storm, illuminating the tiny cabin like a stage. Inside, a bond was forming, invisible but unbreakable, ancient and undeniable. Neither of them fully understood it yet, but both of them felt it, and nothing would ever be the same. The helicopter ride was a blur of noise and exhaustion. Bryn had never been in a helicopter before. She had never been in any aircraft before. The closest she had come to flying was climbing to the top of Eagle Peak when she was 15, looking out over the vast wilderness of Montana and wondering what it would feel like to have wings. Now she was wrapped in a thermal blanket that cost more than everything she had ever owned, combined, strapped into a leather seat that probably cost more than the cabin she had just left behind, and watching the snowy peaks of the Rimke Mountains shrink beneath her like a model diorama. She should have been terrified. She should have been overwhelmed by the strangeness of it all. Instead, exhaustion claimed her before they even cleared the tree line, her head drooping against the leather headrest as 3 days of superhuman effort finally caught up with her. She didn't feel Kyle Thornwood carefully adjust her position so that her head rested on his shoulder instead of the cold window. She didn't see the look he gave his men, a look that said very clearly that if anyone so much as glanced at the sleeping woman wrong, they would lose their eyes and possibly more. She didn't hear the quiet conversation between KL and his Gamma Ronin as they discussed what had happened. The ambush, the traitor who had clearly leaked their patrol route, the political implications of the Alpha King nearly dying on what should have been a routine inspection. She simply slept, deep and dreamless, cocooned in warmth and the subtle, spicy scent of the man beside her. For the first time in months, she felt safe. When she finally stirred, the world had transformed completely. Gone was the endless white of the Montana wilderness. Gone were the jagged peaks and frozen valleys. Instead, she was looking through a pristine glass window at a city that glittered like a scattered handful of diamonds against the velvet darkness of night. "Welcome to Aurelia," Cale said softly. He hadn't moved an inch during the entire flight, keeping perfectly still to avoid disturbing her rest. "And that is home." Bryn pressed her face to the window, her breath fogging the cold glass. The city sprawled across a valley surrounded by mountains, its lights twinkling in patterns that spoke of careful urban planning and unimaginable wealth. Towers of glass and steel rose toward the sky, interspersed with older buildings of stone and brick that hinted at centuries of history. Wide boulevards radiated out from a central point like the spokes of a wheel, but dominating everything rising from the heart of the city like a declaration of absolute power was the Obsidian Palace. It was built into the side of a massive dormant volcano, its black walls seeming to grow organically from the dark stone of the mountain itself. Thousands of golden lights illuminated its spires and battlements, giving it an almost ethereal glow against the night sky. It looked ancient and modern simultaneously, impenetrable, eternal, beautiful in a terrifying way. "I can't go in there," Bryn whispered, suddenly acutely aware of her muddy boots, her tangled hair, the oversized, blood-stained coat she was still wearing. "I look like a beggar." Kale turned her face toward him with a gentle finger under her chin. The fire in his stare was soft now, warm rather than burning. "You are my guest," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "And in my home, you rank higher than any diplomat, higher than any visiting alpha, higher than anyone except me." "You are the woman who saved my life," he interrupted firmly. "That is all anyone needs to know." The helicopter touched down on a private landing pad at the top of the palace. The moment the doors opened, a controlled chaos descended upon them. Medical personnel in crisp white coats swarmed forward with stretchers and equipment ready to attend to the injured vanguard. Kale waved them toward his men, barking orders about which wolves needed immediate attention and which could wait for standard treatment. Guards in tactical gear materialized from the shadows, forming a protective perimeter, their eyes scanning the darkness for threats. And cutting through the organized frenzy, moving with the quiet authority of someone who had been running this palace for decades, came a woman with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from marble. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice somehow carrying clearly despite the helicopter's fading rotors. "We received your emergency transmission. The medical wing is prepared. The council has been notified. Your quarters are ready." Kale stepped out of the helicopter and turned back to help Bryn down. Her legs were like jelly after the long flight, still weak from the ordeal of the past few days, and she stumbled on the landing pad. Without a word, without even a moment of hesitation, Kale scooped her up into his arms. "I can walk," Bryn protested weakly, painfully conscious of the dozens of eyes now watching them. People were staring. Important-looking people. People who probably thought she was insane for arguing with a king. "And I can carry you," Kale replied, a hint of amusement in his voice. "One of these options is significantly more efficient." He turned to the silver-haired woman who was observing the exchange with an expression of carefully controlled surprise. "Miriam, this is Bryn Holloway. She is responsible for saving my life and the lives of my entire vanguard. She is to be treated as an honored guest of the crown. Her needs are to be anticipated and met before she even has to ask. Is that understood?" Miriam's sharp eyes swept over Bryn, taking in her bedraggled appearance, her exhausted face, her position in the king's arms. Whatever conclusions she drew, she kept them hidden behind a mask of perfect professionalism. "Of course, Your Majesty. I'll see to it personally." "Good." Kale's voice softened slightly. "Have Dr. Thornton meet us in the royal wing meeting. I want a complete medical evaluation tonight." "For yourself," Sire Miriam asked. "For her." Without waiting for a response, Kale strode across the landing pad and into the palace, carrying Bryn as if she weighed nothing at all. The interior of the Obsidian Palace was even more overwhelming than its exterior. Corridors of black marble stretched in every direction, polished to such a high shine that Bryn could see her reflection in the floor. Golden sconces lined the walls, casting warm pools of light against the dark stone. Tapestries depicting ancient battles and historic ceremonies hung between the sconces, their threads gleaming with what she suspected was actual gold and silver. Staff members in crisp uniforms pressed themselves against the walls as Kyle passed, bowing low, their eyes carefully averted. Bryn caught fragments of whispered conversation in their wake, but she couldn't make out the words. She could guess, though. They were probably wondering who the bedraggled woman in the king's arms was, probably making assumptions that would spread through the palace like wildfire. She buried her face against Kyle's chest, overwhelmed by the attention. "They're staring," she mumbled against the fine fabric of the blanket wrapped around his shoulders. "Let them stare," Kale replied, and she could hear the amusement in his voice. "They've never seen me carry anyone before. It's good for them to be confused occasionally. Keeps them on their toes." He didn't take her to a guest wing as she had expected. Instead, he carried her through a set of massive double doors, guarded by four of the largest men Bryn had ever seen, down a private corridor and into a suite of rooms that made her breath catch in her throat. The royal quarters were enormous. The main sitting room alone was larger than the entire cabin she had been living in, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering city below. Rich carpets in deep reds and golds covered the obsidian floor. A fireplace large enough to walk into dominated one wall, already crackling with a cheerful blaze. Furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum was arranged in elegant groupings throughout the space. Kael set her down on a velvet chaise lounge and stepped back, though he seemed reluctant to break contact entirely. His hand lingered on her shoulder for a moment before dropping away. "Dr. Thornton will be here shortly," he said. "He's the best physician in the territory. He'll make certain you're properly cared for." "I'm fine," Bryn said, automatically the same words she had spoken 1,000 times before when people asked about her welfare. It was easier than explaining, easier than admitting weakness. "I'm not the one who got shot with wolfsbane rounds." Something flickered in Kael's ancient amber eyes, something that looked almost like pain. "You're not fine," he said quietly. "You're exhausted, you're injured. The marks of your ordeal are written on your body." He gestured vaguely at her bandaged hands, her visible ribs, the dark circles under her eyes. "The doctor will examine you." "That's not a request, Bryn. It's a necessity." Before she could argue further, there was a knock at the door. A kindly-looking man with wire-rimmed glasses and a leather medical bag entered, followed closely by Miriam. "Your Majesty," the doctor said, offering a respectful bow. "You wanted to see me?" Kael gestured toward Bryn. "Not me, Dr. Thornton. Her. I want a complete examination, full blood work, nutritional assessment, everything." The next hour was the most thorough medical evaluation Bryn had ever experienced. Dr. Thornton was gentle but meticulous. He checked her vital signs with instruments that looked far more advanced than anything she had seen in Silver Pine's rudimentary clinic. He drew blood with a practiced hand. He examined every visible injury, from the raw wounds on her palms to the old poorly healed fracture in her left wrist that she hadn't even known was visible. He asked questions about her diet, her living conditions, her medical history. He made notes in a small leather journal, his kind face growing more concerned with each new finding. Kael had stepped into an adjoining room to deal with what Miriam called urgent matters of state, but Bryn could still feel his attention focused on her. Even through walls, even at a distance, she was aware of him in a way she couldn't explain. It was like a thread connecting them, invisible but unbreakable. When Dr. Thornton finally closed his medical bag, his expression was grim. "Miss Holloway," he said carefully, "you're in very poor physical condition. Severe malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies across multiple categories, signs of chronic stress and sleep deprivation." He consulted his notes. "There are old fractures in your left wrist that healed without proper medical care. Your immune system is significantly compromised." He looked up at her, and his professional mask slipped slightly to reveal genuine concern. "Frankly," he said, "I'm astonished you're still standing. What you did last night, the physical exertion of moving 11 adult shifters through a blizzard, it should have been impossible for someone in your condition." Bryn shrugged, the gesture as familiar and automatic as breathing. "I'm an Omega," she said simply, as if that explained everything. Because in her experience, it did. Omegas were the lowest rung of pack hierarchy. Omegas did the work no one else wanted to do. Omegas didn't complain, didn't ask for help, didn't expect anything better. Dr. Thornton's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Holloway," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "being an Omega does not mean you deserve to suffer. It does not mean you should be denied basic medical care or adequate nutrition or human decency." He snapped his bag shut with perhaps more force than necessary. "I don't know what kind of pack you came from, but I want you to understand something. You are in the Obsidian Palace now, and here we treat every wolf with dignity and respect, regardless of their rank, regardless of their designation." He stood and his expression softened slightly. "I'm prescribing a comprehensive nutritional rehabilitation program. Meals will be prepared specifically for your needs. Supplements will be provided. And I want to see you again in 1 week to check your progress." He paused at the door. "You're stronger than you know, Miss Holloway. Saving those wolves with your bare hands in your condition, That wasn't just impressive, it was remarkable. Whatever you've been told about being defective or worthless, I want you to know that from a medical perspective, it couldn't be further from the truth. After the doctor left, Miriam took over. She led Bryn through the sitting room and into a bathroom that was larger than the entire cabin she had been living in. A sunken marble tub dominated the center of the space, already filled with steaming water that smelled of jasmine and rose. Fluffy towels were stacked on heated racks. An array of soaps and oils lined the edge of the tub in crystal bottles. Bryn stared at it all with something approaching disbelief. "This is for me. Everything in this wing is at your disposal," Miriam said, already moving to lay out fresh clothing on a marble bench. "The king has given very specific instructions regarding your comfort." Bryn watched her move around the bathroom with practiced efficiency. Why, she asked quietly, why would he do all this for me? I'm nobody. A banished Omega. I don't understand. Miriam paused in her work. For a long moment she was silent, her back to Bryn, her hands resting on a stack of clean towels. Then she turned and her marble-carved face showed the first hint of genuine emotion Bryn had seen. "I have known His Majesty since he was a pup," she said slowly. "I watched him grow from a fierce solitary boy into an even fiercer man. I have seen him lead armies. I have seen him destroy enemies. I have seen him carry the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders for longer than most wolves have been alive." She stepped closer, her sharp eyes searching Bryn's face. "But I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you," she said. "Never, in all my years of service." "What does that mean?" Bryn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know yet," Miriam admitted, "but I suspect we'll all find out soon enough." She moved toward the door. "Take your time in the bath, Miss Holloway. When you're ready, there are fresh clothes on the bench. The king has requested your presence for a private dinner, but he insisted I tell you that attendance is entirely optional. Your comfort comes first." She paused at the threshold, her hand on the doorframe. "Miss Holloway, whatever brought you to that cabin in Montana, whatever hardships you've endured, they're over now. You're safe here. I give you my word." The door closed behind her. Bryn stood in the middle of the ridiculous bathroom, surrounded by luxury. She had never imagined dressed in clothes that were more dirt than fabric at this point, and felt something crack inside her chest. Not break. Crack. Like ice beginning to thaw after a long, frozen winter. She stripped off her ruined clothes and lowered herself into the bath. The water was perfect. Hot enough to chase the permanent chill from her bones, scented with flowers she couldn't name, silky with oils that made her skin feel like something other than a rough leather. She sank in up to her chin and closed her eyes. And for the first time since she had walked out of Silverpine 3 months ago, she let herself cry. Not the silent, choked-back tears of despair that she had shed alone in her cabin. Not the frustrated tears of hunger or cold or loneliness. These were different. These were tears of release, of tension finally unwinding, of walls finally beginning to crumble. She cried for the girl who had been thrown away by everyone who should have loved her. She cried for the years of whispered insults and casual cruelties she had endured in silence. She cried for the night she had walked out of Silverpine with nothing but the clothes on her back and the knowledge that no one would ever come looking for her. And then when the tears were spent, she washed her face and got out of the bath. The clothes Miriam had laid out were simple but exquisite. A soft cashmere sweater in a deep midnight blue. Wool trousers that fit perfectly, though Bryn had no idea how they could have known her size. Undergarments made of silk so fine she was almost afraid to touch them. There was even a selection of shoes. She chose the simplest pair, soft leather flats that felt like walking on clouds. When she finally stood before the full-length mirror, she almost didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. Her skin was pink and clean scrubbed free of months of accumulated grime. Her hair, now washed and combed, fell in soft chestnut waves around her shoulders. The blue of the sweater brought out the color of her eyes, which she had always thought were a muddy, unremarkable brown, but which now seemed almost violet in the soft light. She still looked too thin. She could still count her ribs. But she didn't look like a beggar anymore. She looked like someone who might belong in a palace. A knock at the door made her jump. "Miss Holloway." Miriam's voice came through the wood. "The king is ready for you whenever you're comfortable." Bryn took a deep breath. She straightened her shoulders. She lifted her chin. "I'm ready." The private dining room was intimate by palace standards, which meant it was only about the size of a normal house's entire first floor. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth. Candles flickered on every surface, casting dancing shadows on the obsidian walls. A table set for two occupied the center of the room, laden with more food than Bryn had seen in months. And standing by the window silhouetted against the glittering cityscape was Carol Thornwood. He had changed since the helicopter. Gone was the blanket and borrowed clothes ensemble from earlier. Now he wore a charcoal gray suit that had clearly been tailored specifically for his massive frame. The jacket strained slightly against his shoulders. A crisp white shirt was open at the collar. His black hair was still slightly damp from what she assumed had been his own bath. He looked every inch the king he was. But when he turned and saw her, standing in the doorway, something changed. The regal mask slipped just for a moment, and underneath was an expression of such naked wonder that Bryn felt her cheeks flush. "Breathtaking," he said softly. Bryn looked down at herself at the borrowed clothes that fit too well at the shoes that were softer than anything she had ever worn. "It's just clean clothes," she said, trying to deflect the intensity of his gaze. "No," Kel moved toward her, his footsteps silent on the carpeted floor. He stopped when he was close enough to touch, though he kept his hands at his sides. "The clothes are just fabric. You are breathtaking." The air between them seemed to thicken. Bryn could feel that strange pulling sensation in her chest again, stronger now than it had been in the cabin. Like a golden thread connecting her to him, tightening with every breath. Kael seemed to shake himself, as if breaking free of a spell. "Come," he said, stepping back and gesturing toward the table. "Eat. The doctor was very specific about your nutritional needs. The kitchen has been working for hours to prepare appropriate dishes." The meal was unlike anything Bryn had ever tasted. Course after course of food designed specifically for her rehabilitation, but prepared with such skill that each dish was a revelation. Rich bone broth fortified with minerals and herbs. Tender proteins cooked to melting perfection. Vegetables roasted with seasonings she couldn't name their flavors, complex and satisfying. She tried to eat slowly to pace herself to remember her manners in front of a king. But her starving body had other ideas. Before she knew it, she had cleaned 2 plates and was reaching for a third. Kael watched her eat with an expression of quiet satisfaction, though he barely touched his own food. "Tell me about Silverpine," he said eventually. "Tell me about your life before." Bryn set down her fork, suddenly self-conscious. "There's not much to tell," she said carefully. "My mother died giving birth to me. My father was a warrior in the pack. He died when I was 14, killed in a rogue attack." She shrugged, trying to make the gesture casual, despite the old pain it stirred. "After that, I was just the orphan Omega who couldn't shift, a burden on pack resources. Alpha Drummond tolerated me as long as my father was alive, to advocate for me. After he was gone," she trailed off. "And no one stood up for you," Kael said. "It wasn't a question. I was nobody." Bryn said the words familiar and bitter on her tongue. An Omega without a wolf, without family, without value. Why would anyone risk their position for that? Kael's jaw tightened visibly. "Because it's right," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Because protecting the vulnerable is the fundamental responsibility of the strong. Because a pack that throws away its weakest members doesn't deserve to call itself a pack at all." He leaned forward, and the fire in his stare blazed with sudden intensity. "Silas Drummond has been Alpha of Silverpine for 15 years now. In all that time, he never visited the capital, never paid proper tribute to the crown, never answered summons to the king's council. I assumed he was simply incompetent, running a remote territory with minimal oversight." His voice dropped to something that was almost a growl. "I didn't realize he was also a monster." "He's not a monster," Bryn said automatically, then caught herself. "I mean, that's how it's always been. Omegas without wolves are liabilities, everyone knows that." Kael stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, and stared out at the city that sprawled beneath his palace. "Do you know how old I am, Bryn?" She hesitated, thrown by the sudden change of subject. No, I assumed 30, 35. A bark of laughter escaped him. It was not a happy sound. "I am 147 years old." Bryn's jaw dropped. "What, the Alphaking bloodline?" Kael said, still facing the window. "We age differently than other wolves. Something in our genetics tied to the power we carry. My father lived to be 400. My grandfather ruled for 6 centuries before him. He turned to face her. I have been king for 112 years, Bryn. I have seen packs rise and fall. I have seen laws change and evolve. I have fought to build a society where every wolf, regardless of rank or power or designation, is treated with basic dignity. He walked back to the table, his eyes never leaving hers. And I have never, in all my years, believed that omegas without wolves are disposable. That philosophy is ancient, barbaric, a relic of times when we fought for bare survival rather than building civilization. He sat down across from her, close enough now that Bryn could see the fine details of his face, the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of centuries of responsibility, the silver threading through his black hair at the temples. Silas Drummond believes what he believes because no one has ever challenged him, Cale said, because he operates in a remote territory and thinks he's beyond the reach of the crown. A smile crossed his face. It was not a kind smile. He's about to learn otherwise. Bryn felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? Kyle reached across the table and took her hand. His skin was warm, almost hot, and the contact sent a jolt of electricity up her arm. I summoned him, Kyle said. This morning before we left Montana, a formal summons to the Obsidian Palace. He paused and that wolf-like smile widened. He believes he's being rewarded, Cale continued. Rewarded for his pack's brave assistance in rescuing me from the ambush. He thinks he's coming here to receive honors and accolades. But his pack didn't rescue you, Bryn said slowly, understanding dawning. I did. Exactly. Cale's eyes glittered with satisfaction. He's coming here to claim credit for a heroic deed he didn't perform, to lie to his king's face, and he has no idea that the real hero of the story will be standing right beside me when he does. Bryn's heart began to pound. You want me there. When he arrives, I want you to see justice done, Cale said, squeezing her by her arm. I want you to watch the man who threw you away realize exactly how grave a mistake he made. I want him to know before I strip everything from him that you are the reason for his downfall. He paused and something vulnerable flickered in those ancient eyes. But only if you want to, he added. Only if you're strong enough. I will not force you into anything, Bryn. If you want to stay hidden to never see his face again, I will respect that choice absolutely. His grip on her hand tightened. I am asking you to trust me. I am asking you to be brave one more time. Can you do that? Bryn looked at the man who had destroyed 3 attackers for laying hands on her, who had carried her through a palace like she was something precious, who had ordered doctors and servants and probably half a kingdom to attend to her comfort. She thought about Silas Drummond, who had looked at her like she was garbage and told her to leave or die. She thought about Thane, whose hand around her throat she could still feel. She thought about all the years of whispered insults and casual cruelties, the isolation, the despair. And something inside her, right, something that had been cowering in fear for as long as she could remember, finally stood up straight. Yes, she said, I'll do it. Kael's smile transformed his face. For a moment, he didn't look like a terrifying king. He looked almost boyish, relieved. Good, he said. Good. Now, there's something else we need to discuss. His expression grew serious again. What I'm about to tell you may sound strange. It may sound impossible. But I need you to listen, and I need you to believe me. Bryn nodded here, her stomach tightening with sudden anxiety. There's a reason I reacted the way I did when Thane attacked you, Cale said slowly. A reason beyond simple gratitude or protectiveness. A reason tied to the oldest magic of our kind. He stood and walked around the table until he was standing before her chair. Then slowly he lowered himself to one knee. Cale Thornwood Alpha, King of North America, knelt on the floor in front of her like a supplicant before a shrine. Among wolves, he said, there is a bond, a connection that transcends ordinary attraction or affection. It's called a mate bond. When 2 souls that are destined for each other come into contact, they recognize each other. The wolf inside knows even before the human mind can fully understand. Bryn's breath caught in her throat. I felt it the moment you touched me in that cabin, Cale continued. My wolf, which has been silent about such things my entire life, suddenly roared with certainty. You are my mate, Bryn Holloway, my destined partner, the other half of my soul. He reached up and took her hands in his. I know this is sudden. I know this is overwhelming, and I will not force this bond on you. If you choose to reject it, I will respect your decision and never speak of it again." He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw fear in his eyes. Not the fear of battle or death, but the fear of rejection. The fear of losing something precious before he truly had the chance to hold it. "But I wanted you to know," he said quietly. "I wanted you to understand what you are to me, what you could be." Bryn stared at the Alpha King kneeling before her. This man who commanded armies, who ruled a continent, who was feared by everyone who knew his name. He was on his knees, for her, the wolfless Omega, the cast-off, the nobody. "I don't understand," she whispered. "How can I be your mate? I don't even have a wolf," Kale smiled. "Are you certain about that?" "What do you mean?" He rose to his feet, pulling her up with him. "There are legends," he said, "about certain wolves, special wolves. Their power is so great, so vast that it remains dormant for years, sometimes for decades, waiting for the right catalyst, the right trigger to bring it forth." He cupped her face in his hands. "No ordinary pack could awaken a wolf like that. No ordinary alpha has the strength to call it out. But a king," his voice dropped to a whisper, "a king's power can wake what nothing else can reach." Bryn shook her head, trying to process what he was saying. "You think I have a wolf after all these years of nothing? After everyone telling me I was defective?" "I don't think," Kale said. "I know. I can feel her, Bryn, sleeping deep inside you, waiting. She's been waiting for someone strong enough to call her forth." He pressed his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her lips. "Tomorrow Silas Drummond will arrive. Tomorrow we will destroy him together. And after that, when you're ready, we will discover exactly what kind of wolf has been hiding inside you all along." Bryn closed her eyes. She could feel his breath on her skin, his warmth surrounding her, the golden thread between them pulling tighter with every heartbeat. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "But tonight you rest. Tonight you are safe. Tonight you let yourself begin to heal." He pulled back slightly and gestured toward a door on the far side of the room. "Your chambers are through there, adjacent to mine but completely separate. You have total privacy. Guards outside will ensure no one disturbs you for any reason." He paused at the door at his hand on the frame. "Sleep well, Bryn Holloway. Tomorrow we change everything." And then he was gone. Bryn stood alone in the elegant dining room, surrounded by the remnants of a meal that would have fed her for a month, dressed in clothes that cost more than her entire previous existence. Tomorrow she would face the man who had thrown her away. Tomorrow she would watch him fall. And tomorrow she might finally discover who she truly was. She walked to her chambers, crawled into a bed softer than clouds, and slept without dreams. The morning arrived far too quickly. Bryn woke to golden sunlight streaming through windows and the smell of fresh breakfast on a tray beside her bed. She ate mechanically, her mind racing ahead to what was coming. Miriam appeared promptly, as if summoned by thought, bearing an armful of clothing options. "His Majesty has requested that you dress formally for the audience," she said, laying out the choices on the bed with practiced efficiency. "But he was quite insistent that the final selection is entirely yours." So, the dress Bryn chose was midnight blue silk, the same color as the sweater from the night before, but infinitely more elegant. It fell to her ankles in a waterfall of soft fabric, modest enough to be comfortable but beautiful enough to make a statement. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Miriam had arranged her hair into an elegant twist. Simple jewelry adorned her neck and ears, silver set with pale blue stones that matched her gown. Her skin glowed with the benefits of good food and rest. She didn't look like a banished Omega anymore. She looked like someone who belonged beside a king. A knock at the door. "Bryn." Kale's voice came through the polished wood. "It's time." She took a deep breath. She straightened her shoulders. She lifted her chin, and she opened the door to face her destiny. Kyle was waiting in the corridor, and for a moment both of them simply stared. He was wearing a black suit today, perfectly tailored, severe, and elegant. A deep crimson shirt underneath matched the ring of rubies on his right hand. His dark hair was swept back from his face. His amber eyes burned with barely contained anticipation. "You look," he started, then stopped, shook his head. "There are no words." Bryn felt herself blush despite everything. "You look like a king," she managed. "Today," he said, offering her his arm, I feel like one. They walked together through the corridors of the palace, and this time Bryn didn't hide from the stairs. She met them, acknowledged them. Let the servants and guards see her walking beside their king with her head held high. The great hall of the obsidian palace was designed to make people feel small. The ceiling soared 50 feet above them, supported by massive columns of black marble wrapped in gold leaf. Tapestries depicting centuries of royal history hung on every wall. Thousands of candles burned in chandeliers that looked like frozen waterfalls of crystal and gold. At the far end of the hall, raised on a dais 5 feet above the floor, sat the onyx throne. It was carved from a single massive piece of volcanic glass polished to a mirror, shine inlaid with gold and precious stones. Kale ascended the dais and sat, and the transformation was instantaneous. The man who had knelt before her last night, vulnerable and hopeful, was gone. In his place was the Alphaking, cold and terrifying, and absolutely in control. Bryn was positioned in an alcove to the right of the throne, hidden behind a sheer curtain. She could see everything, but no one could see her. The vanguard stood on the steps below the throne, now dressed in formal uniforms, their faces expressions of stone. Ronan with his blonde hair pulled back severely. Beckett with his eyes constantly scanning the room. The others, whose names she had learned that morning, each one a legend in their own right. All of them were alive because of her. "They're here," Miriam announced from the doorway. "Send them in," Kale commanded. The massive doors at the end of the hall groaned open. An Alpha Silas Drummond walked into the trap. He looked exactly as Bryn remembered. Thick-set with thinning hair combed over a balding pate, small, mean eyes set too close together in a fleshy face. His suit was expensive but ill-fitting, straining across his belly and bunching at the shoulders. He walked with a swagger that was meant to project confidence, but only projected ignorance. Behind him came Thane, his arm now in a proper sling, rather than the hasty bandage he had fashioned during his flight. His face was pale and sweating, but he still managed to look arrogant somehow. And trailing them both were two pack advisors trying desperately to look important and failing miserably. Bryn's heart began to pound as she watched them approach. This was the man who had destroyed her life, who had looked at her like she was less than nothing, who had sentenced her to death in the frozen wilderness with as little thought as he would give to swatting a flum, and he had no idea that she was standing 15 feet away, about to watch his world crumble. Alpha Silas reached the base of the dais and bowed low. It was a practiced bow, formal and respectful, but something about the way he held himself suggested he didn't really feel the respect he was showing. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice oozing with false humility, "we are deeply humbled by your summons. It is a tremendous honor to stand before the onyx throne." Kale didn't move, didn't smile, didn't acknowledge the greeting with anything more than a slight nod. "Rise, Alpha Silas," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I hear I have you to thank for my life." Silas stood puffing out his chest like a ridiculous bird. "We did only what any loyal pack would do, Your Majesty. When we heard about the attack in the mountains, I immediately deployed my very best trackers. My enforcer here led the rescue team personally." He gestured at Thane, who somehow managed to look both terrified and smug at the same time. "Is that so?" KL said. "Tell me more. How exactly did you find us?" "It was extremely difficult," Silas said, warming to his lie with visible enthusiasm. "The blizzard made normal tracking essentially impossible, but Thane persevered against all odds. He followed the scent of wolfsbane through the storm. He found the rogues who had attacked you and drove them off in fierce combat." Behind her curtain, Bryn clamped a hand over her mouth. The audacity of the lie was staggering. They hadn't fought anyone. They hadn't rescued anyone. They had come to harass a defenseless girl. "And your men," Kale pressed his voice, giving nothing away. "They actually fought these rogues hand to hand, Your Majesty." Silas's confidence grew with every word. "It was a vicious, desperate battle. Thane nearly lost his arm protecting your fallen warriors from further attack." He gestured at Thane's sling, his expression one of paternal pride. "A war wound," he said, "but he would gladly sacrifice more than an arm for his king." Kale's expression remained utterly neutral. "And the cabin," he said. "The trapper's shack where my men and I were found recovering." "What did you observe there?" Silas hesitated just for a fraction of a second. "A ruin," he said smoothly. "Empty. It looked like it had been abandoned for years." "Empty," Kale repeated. "You're absolutely certain of that?" "Completely certain, Your Majesty. We conducted a thorough search. Kale leaned forward on his throne just slightly. That's very strange, he said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. Because I distinctly remember someone being there. A woman. Silas's face flickered. Just for an instant, surprise breaking through his mask of false confidence. A woman, Your Majesty? He forced a laugh, perhaps a hallucination from the wolfsbane poisoning. The only person who ever lived in that sector was a banished Omega. She died in the cold months ago. A tragedy, of course. But nature is cruel to the weak. The temperature in the Great Halls seemed to drop several degrees. Died, Kao repeated. You're saying she's dead? I'm afraid so, Silas said, arranging his features into an expression of mock sorrow. We checked on her, of course, found her frozen in the snow near her cabin. There was nothing we could do. Kale stood. He descended the steps of the dais one by one. Each footfall echoed through the silent hall like a drumbeat. His eyes never left Silas's face. He stopped when he was close enough to smell the fear beginning to leak through Silas's confident facade. Nature is cruel, Kale agreed softly. But liars are crueler still. Your Majesty. Silas stammered, confusion and terror warring on his face. I don't understand what you're implying. Kale turned his head toward the alcove. Bryn, he called out, come here, please. The curtain parted, and Bryn Holloway stepped into the light. She watched Silas's face as he processed what he was seeing. First confusion as his brain struggled to reconcile the elegant woman before him with his memories. Then disbelief as recognition slowly dawned. And finally a horror so profound it seemed to age him 10 years in a single heartbeat. She walked across the hall, her silk dress whispering against the polished marble floor. She kept her head high, her eyes forward. She didn't look at Thane, though she could feel his terrified gaze burning into her. She stopped beside Kale, and he took her hand in his. Alpha Silas, Kale said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. Allow me to introduce Bryn Holloway. The woman you just claimed was dead. The woman who single-handedly saved 11 of my warriors in a blizzard with nothing but her bare hands and her stubborn will. The woman who cleaned wolfsbane from my blood while your enforcer was assaulting her. Silas's legs gave out. He dropped to his knees on the polished floor. Impossible, he whispered, his voice cracking. You can't be here. You're nothing. You're a wolfless Omega. You're defective. I'm standing in the Obsidian Palace, Bryn said. Her voice came out stronger than she expected. Steadier. And you're on your knees. Silas turned desperately to Thane. You said she was handled, he hissed. You said the cabin was empty. You said Thane was trembling so badly his sling was shaking visibly. The wolves, he stammered. They came out of nowhere. The black one I couldn't my arm. The black one, Kale said pleasantly, was me. All remaining color drained from Silas's face. He turned back to Kale, tears beginning to stream down his cheeks. Your Majesty, please, he begged. I didn't know. I had no idea she was important. She was just a wolfless Omega, a drain on resources. I was following the old laws. I was only doing what any alpha would do to protect pack resources. You were throwing away a member of your pack to die, Kale interrupted. His voice was ice given form. You were banishing a young woman to the frozen wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back. You were treating a living being like garbage because she didn't meet your arbitrary criteria for usefulness. This response paused because Claude reached its max length for a message. Hit continued to nudge Claude along. His eyes blazed with barely contained fury. And then you came here, to my palace, and you lied to your king about it. He turned to Bryn. Is there anything you want to say to him? Bryn looked at the man who had haunted her nightmares for 3 months. He seemed smaller now. Pathetic. A bully stripped of his power, groveling in the dust of his own making. She thought about all the things she wanted to say, all the accusations she could make, all the pain she could pour out. But in the end, only one thing truly mattered. She stepped forward, forcing Silas to crane his neck to look up at her. You told me I was worthless, she said quietly. You told me I was a curse. You told me to leave or be hunted like an animal. She felt Kyle's presence behind her, solid and warm and absolutely furious on her behalf. But here's what you didn't know, she continued. I didn't die in that cabin. I survived. I built a life with nothing. I kept myself alive through the coldest winter in 50 years with no help from anyone. She leaned down until her face was inches from his. And when 11 wolves were dying in the snow, I saved them, every single one of them, with my bare hands, with my human strength, with everything you said made me worthless. She straightened, and her voice rang out clear and strong. So who's the curse now, Alpha Drummond? She stepped back to Kale's side. Silas collapsed completely sobbing against the polished floor. Ugly sounds that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Kale's voice rang out like a death knell. Alpha Silas Drummond of the Silver Pine Pack, you are hereby stripped of your rank and title effective immediately. Your pack is dissolved and reassigned to the Western Province under new leadership. All your personal assets are forfeit to the crown. No! Silas wailed, his face pressed against the floor. Please have mercy. I beg you, mercy. Kale repeated the word as if tasting it. You want mercy? He looked at Bryn. What do you think, he asked. Should we show him mercy? Bryn considered the question carefully. She thought about the freezing nights alone in her cabin, the gnawing hunger that had become her constant companion, the slow, grinding despair of knowing that no one in the world cared whether she lived or died. She thought about Thane's hand around her throat, the fear in those terrible moments. She thought about the night she had walked away from everything she knew with nothing but the clothes on her back. Give him the same mercy he gave me, she said. Kale smiled. It was a terrible smile. You heard her, he said to the guards. Take Alpha Silas to the northern border. Strip him of everything but the clothes on his back. Leave him in the wilderness. He paused. If he survives the winter, he can keep his miserable life. If not, well, he shrugged. Nature is cruel to the weak. Guards swarmed forward. Silas screamed as they dragged him toward the doors, his pleas for mercy echoing off the marble walls. Thane tried to flee, but more guards were waiting. This one goes to the dungeons, Kale said coldly. Assault on royal property. He can contemplate his choices in the dark. Thane's screams joined his alphas as he was dragged through a different door toward the bowels of the palace where the ancient cells waited. The dungeons of the Obsidian Palace had held traitors for centuries. He would have a very long time to remember the moment he had wrapped his hand around the future queen's throat. The massive doors slammed shut. Silence fell over the great hall. Bryn stood frozen in place, trembling, tears streaming down her face. It was over. 3 months of suffering, years of abuse before that. A lifetime of being told she was worthless, defective, cursed. It was finally irrevocably over. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind. Kale pulled her against his chest, his warmth enveloping her completely. You did it, he murmured against her hair. You were magnificent. I don't feel magnificent, she whispered back. I feel... She couldn't find the words. Free, Kale suggested. You feel free. And she realized he was right. For the first time in her entire life, the chains she hadn't even known she was wearing had finally fallen away. She was free. And she was just beginning to discover who she truly was. The silence in the great hall after the guards dragged Silas away was heavy, but it was not oppressive. It was the silence of a storm finally breaking. The silence of old wounds finally beginning to heal. The silence of a life finally beginning again. Bryn stood in Kale's arms, trembling, tears streaming freely down her face. She couldn't seem to stop shaking. Her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was draining away, leaving her hollow and raw, and somehow impossibly lighter than she had ever felt. I have you, Kale murmured against her hair. I have you. You're safe. It's over. She turned in his embrace and buried her face against his chest. The tears came harder now, great racking sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the girl who had been thrown away like garbage. She cried for the years of whispered insults and casual cruelties she had endured in silence. She cried for the night she had walked out of Silverpine with nothing but the clothes on her back and the absolute certainty that no one would ever come looking for her. And she cried with relief, with release, with the overwhelming realization that the man who had haunted her nightmares was gone, sent to the very frozen hell he had condemned her to. Kale held her through all of it. He didn't try to stop her tears or tell her to be strong. He simply stood there, solid and warm and absolutely present, letting her fall apart in the safety of his arms. When the sobs finally subsided, Bryn pulled back and looked up at him. His eyes were soft, filled with a tenderness that seemed impossible on such a fierce face. You really meant it, she whispered. Everything you said about the mate bond. Ko cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that lingered on her cheeks. Every word he said. From the moment I opened my eyes in that cabin and saw you fighting to save me, I knew. My wolf knew. We have been waiting for you, Bryn Holloway, for longer than you can possibly imagine. He pressed his forehead against hers. I have lived for 147 years, he said quietly. I have ruled for over a century. I have seen empires rise and fall, watched generations of wolves live and die, carried the weight of a kingdom on my shoulders through wars and plagues and endless political scheming. And in all that time, I never found my mate, never felt the bond that legend says will snap into place when two souls recognize each other across time and space. He pulled back to look into her eyes. I began to believe I didn't have one, that the moon goddess had looked at me, seen the darkness in my heart, the blood on my hands, and decided I didn't deserve that kind of connection. His voice dropped to a whisper. And then you appeared, performing that impossible rescue on the mountain, cleaning poison from my wounds with your bare hands, standing between me and armed enemies with nothing but your stubborn courage. You are the most extraordinary person I have ever encountered, Bryn Holloway, and I will spend every remaining day of my very long life proving that I am worthy of you. Bryn shook her head. I'm not extraordinary, she said. I'm just an Omega who couldn't shift. I'm nobody. KL's expression shifted. Something flickered in those ancient amber eyes that she couldn't quite identify. You still believe that, he said slowly. Even after everything you've done, even after everything you've survived, you still believe you're nothing. It's what I've always been told. Then everyone who ever told you that was a fool. He took her hand and led her out of the great hall through a series of corridors she hadn't seen before. They emerged onto a wide balcony overlooking the city, the winter sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered rooftops below. Look, KL said, gesturing at the vast panorama spread before them. This city has stood for 800 years. It has been ruled by my family for 6 centuries. Millions of wolves live within its borders and millions more in the territories beyond. He turned to face her fully. I have commanded armies, he continued. I have negotiated treaties with foreign powers. I have made decisions that affected the lives of countless beings. And in all that time, do you know what I have learned about true power? Bryn shook her head. Power means nothing without purpose, Kale said. Strength means nothing without compassion. The greatest rulers in history weren't the ones who conquered the most territory or accumulated the most wealth. They were the ones who protected the vulnerable, who lifted up the fallen, who saw value in those the world had carelessly cast aside. He took both her hands in his grip warm and secure. You saved 11 dying warriors in a blizzard, he said. You had no supernatural strength, no pack to support you, no obligation to help. You did it simply because it was right, because someone was suffering and you couldn't bring yourself to walk away. His grip tightened. That is true power, Bryn. That is real strength. Everything else is merely window dressing. Bryn felt something shift deep inside her, a crack in the walls she had built around her heart over years of pain and rejection. A beam of light penetrating the darkness she had carried for so long. She looked up at this man, this king, who was gazing at her like she had hung the stars in the sky, and she made a decision. I believe you, she said softly. I don't fully understand it yet. I don't know how to be what you see in me. But I believe you. Kael's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. That's all I ask, he said, that you give yourself a chance, that you let me show you who you really are. He leaned down and pressed his lips gently to her forehead. And speaking of who you really are, he murmured against her skin, there's something important we need to discuss. My wolf, Bryn said. Your wolf, Kael agreed. He pulled back his expression, growing serious. I told you last night that I could feel her sleeping inside you, that she's been waiting for someone strong enough to wake her. You said a king's power could do it. Yes, but it's not merely about raw power. It's about the bond between us, about our souls recognizing each other. He led her back inside through corridors that grew progressively more ancient-looking, and finally into a circular chamber, with a domed ceiling painted with images of wolves running beneath a brilliant full moon. This is the awakening chamber, Hael explained, his voice taking on a reverent tone. In the old days, when a wolf's power was dormant and refused to emerge, their pack would bring them here. The pack would gather. The alpha would lend their strength to help the dormant wolf break through their barriers. He stopped in the center of the room. But your case is different, Bryn. Your wolf isn't merely dormant. She's been suppressed, buried so deep that nothing in Silverpine could have reached her. Not their weak alpha, not their pathetic excuse for pack bonds. He turned to face her. She needed something far stronger. She needed someone whose power could match her own. Bryn's heart was racing. What does that mean exactly? It means that you're not an ordinary Omega, Kale said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. It means that the reason you never shifted wasn't because you were defective or broken. It was because you were too powerful for an ordinary awakening. He reached out and touched her chest right over her heart. There are legends, he said quietly. Ancient stories passed down through generations of royal wolves. Stories about a special kind of shifter. A wolf born perhaps once in 1,000 years. A wolf whose power is so vast, so extraordinary, that it remains dormant until precisely the right catalyst appears. His eyes burned with ancient fire. They call her the moon's chosen, he said. The white wolf. Bryn shook her head in denial. That's just a legend, a fairy tale to tell pups at bedtime. So was the mate bond, Kale replied, until I felt it snap into place the moment you touched me in that cabin. He moved closer, his presence overwhelming. I have lived for nearly 150 years, Bryn. I have witnessed things that most wolves would call absolutely impossible. I have learned never to dismiss the old stories. He cupped her face in his hands. I believe with all my heart that you are the white wolf, he said. I believe your wolf has been waiting specifically for me. And I believe that when we complete the mate bond, when our souls fully and completely connect, she will finally awaken. Bryn's breath caught in her throat. How do we complete the bond? Kale's gaze dropped to her lips. There are several traditional ways, he said, his voice rougher than before. But the simplest is also the most powerful. He leaned down until his mouth was barely a breath away from hers. We kiss, he whispered, and we let our souls recognize each other completely. Bryn's heart was pounding so hard, she was certain he must be able to hear it. Every instinct she possessed was screaming at her. Some told her to run. Some told her to stay. Some told her this was utterly impossible. But one voice, quiet and deep, rising from somewhere she had never consciously felt before, said something entirely different. Finally, it whispered with ancient patience, he's finally here. And Bryn knew with a certainty that transcended logic or reason that this was exactly right. She closed the distance between them. Their lips met, and the world exploded. Energy erupted from the point of contact, a shockwave of pure power that rippled outward in all directions. The candles arranged throughout the chamber blazed bright, their flames shooting toward the ceiling in sudden pillars of fire. The painted wolves on the dome seemed to move, to run, to howl in silent celebration. And deep inside Bryn, something finally woke up. It started as a warmth in her chest, a burning heat that spread outward through her veins like liquid fire. It didn't hurt, not exactly, but it was intensely, overwhelmingly powerful. Like standing in the direct presence of the sun after a lifetime in shadow. Bryn gasped and pulled back from the kiss. What she breathed, looking at her hands which seemed to be glowing faintly. What's happening to me? She's waking, Kale said, his eyes blazing gold with wonder. Don't fight it, Bryn. Let her come. Let her through. But the warmth was growing stronger with every passing second. The heat was becoming a burn. Bryn fell to her knees, clutching her chest as something inside her began to move and shift and change. It hurts, she cried out. Kale dropped beside her, his hands gripping her shoulders firmly. I know, he said, his voice urgent but strangely calm. The first shift is always painful, but you have to let it happen. You have to stop fighting and let her through. Bryn shook her head desperately, tears streaming down her face. I can't. I don't know how. I've never done this before. I don't know what to do. Kale cupped her face and forced her to meet his eyes. Listen to me carefully, he commanded, and there was power in his voice now, ancient authority that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality. You are not alone in this. You have never been alone. Your wolf has been with you every single day of your entire life, waiting, protecting you even when you didn't know she was there. His eyes bore into hers with fierce intensity. She got you through those freezing nights in the cabin. She gave you the strength to save 11 warriors through that blizzard. She kept you alive when everything in the universe said you should have died long ago. He pressed his forehead against hers. She loves you, Bryn, and she's been waiting so desperately long to finally meet you. Let her out. Trust her. Trust yourself. The pain intensified dramatically. Bryn felt her bones beginning to shift, her muscles beginning to tear and reform themselves. It was agony unlike anything she had ever experienced. Worse than hunger, worse than cold, worse than the crushing loneliness that had been her constant companion for years. But underneath the pain, she felt something else entirely. A presence, a consciousness that wasn't quite hers but wasn't quite separate either. A wild, fierce, ancient spirit that had been sleeping in the very depths of her soul, waiting patiently for precisely this moment. Hello, Bryn whispered to it, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. It took so long for me to find you. The wolf responded with a surge of pure love, pure acceptance, pure unbridled joy. And then Bryn stopped fighting. She let go of her human form completely. She let go of her fear. She let go of everything she had ever thought she knew about herself. And she became. The transformation was not gentle. Her body twisted and reformed, bones cracking and reshaping with sounds that echoed through the chamber, skin stretching and sprouting thick fur. She threw her head back and screamed, and halfway through the scream became something else entirely. A howl. A howl so pure and powerful that it shattered every piece of glass in the chamber. A howl that echoed through the corridors of the Obsidian Palace and out into the city beyond. A howl that made every wolf within hearing distance stop whatever they were doing and look up in absolute awe. When it was over, Bryn Holloway was gone. In her place stood a wolf. But she wasn't gray like the common wolves of Silverpine. She wasn't brown or russet or black like the Vanguard. She was white. Pure, blinding, impossible white, like fresh snow on a pristine mountain peak. Her fur seemed to glow with an inner light shimmering and shifting like moonlight dancing on water. She was massive, nearly as large as KL's own wolf form, with eyes that burned silver instead of gold. She was beautiful. She was terrifying. She was legend made flesh. Kale stared at her, his expression one of absolute stunned awe. The white wolf, he breathed reverently. It's true, the legends are all true. Behind him, the door to the chamber burst open. Ronan and Beckett rushed in their faces, alarmed, clearly having heard the explosion of power. They stopped dead in their tracks at what they saw. Moon above Ronan whispered, falling immediately to one knee. The prophecy, it's real. Beckett followed suit, his head bowed in reverence. The moon's chosen, he said softly. She's actually real. All the old stories were true. Bryn, now in wolf form, looked down at her own paws. White fur gleaming like diamonds. Massive claws capable of tearing through steel. Power thrumming through every fiber of her being like electricity. She could hear things she had never heard before. The heartbeats of the men kneeling nearby. The distant sounds of the city far below. The whisper of wind through corridors hundreds of feet away. She could smell things she had never smelled. The individual sense of everyone who had passed through this chamber in the last week. The metallic tang of ancient power embedded in the very stones. The warm, spicy essence of KL, which called to something primal deep inside her. She could feel the pulse of the earth beneath her paws and the distant silvery pull of the moon above. And she could feel Kael, not just his presence in the room, but his thoughts, his emotions. The golden thread between them had become a bridge, a highway, a connection so deep and complete that she couldn't tell where her consciousness ended and his began. Mine, his voice echoed in her mind with fierce possessiveness. She looked at him with her silver eyes and felt a response rise from her wolf, instinctive and absolute. Yours, she answered. Kael smiled, and then his own form began to shift. His transformation was faster than hers, smoother, the result of over a century of practice. In seconds, the man was gone, replaced by the massive black wolf she had first seen in the clearing on that frozen night. He was beautiful in his own right, dark as midnight, powerful as a thunderstorm. But standing next to her blinding white radiance, he didn't seem diminished. He seemed completed. They complemented each other perfectly. Yin and yang, shadow and light, night and day, two halves of one perfect ancient whole. The black wolf approached the white wolf. He touched his muzzle gently to hers. And in that moment of connection with their wolves finally meeting for the first time, the mate bond completed itself with an almost audible snap. Bryn felt it happen, a connection so powerful it stole her breath. Suddenly, she could feel everything Kyle felt. His overwhelming joy, his fierce, desperate love, his absolute unwavering protectiveness, the loneliness of a century spent searching for her, the profound relief of finally finding her. And underneath it all, a vow, a promise written in the very fabric of his eternal soul. I will never let anyone hurt you again. His voice echoed in her mind with absolute certainty. I will burn this world to ashes before I let anyone take you from me. She pressed her great white head against his dark neck. I know, she answered, and I will stand beside you through all of it, through everything, always. They stood there for a long moment, wolf beside wolf, hearts beating as one perfect rhythm. Then slowly they began to shift back. The transformation was easier this time for Bryn, as if her wolf understood the need and cooperated willingly, eagerly. She felt her bones reform her skin, smooth her human consciousness reassert itself fully. When she opened her eyes, she was kneeling on the floor of the chamber, naked and gasping. Kale was beside her instantly, wrapping his jacket around her shoulders, pulling her against his chest. You did it, he murmured against her hair. You found her? She's magnificent. You're magnificent. Bryn laughed. It was a strange sound, wild and free, and completely unlike anything she had ever heard from herself before. I can feel her, she said wonderingly. She's still there inside me. She's always been there my whole life. She was just waiting. Waiting for me, Kale said. Yes, Bryn looked up at him. In her eyes, she noticed still had a faint silver tinge to them. Waiting for someone strong enough to wake her. Waiting for someone worthy of her. She reached up and touched his face. Waiting for you. 1 year later, the winter of 2025 was harsh, one of the coldest on record. Snow blanketed the mountains surrounding Aurelia, and the wind howled through the valleys like a living thing. But inside the obsidian palace, everything was warm. Queen Bryn Thornwood stood on the balcony of the royal chambers, looking out over the city she had come to love. She wore a gown of silver velvet, elegant but comfortable, and a crown of white gold rested on her head. Diamonds sparkled at her throat and ears, but they were nothing compared to the glow of her skin, the shine of her chestnut hair, the quiet confidence that radiated from her every movement. She was not the thin, frightened girl who had been dragged from a cabin in the wilderness a year ago. She was a queen. The changes she had brought to the kingdom in the past 12 months were already legendary. New laws protecting Omegas from abuse and banishment had been enacted across every territory. A network of shelters and support services had been established continent-wide for wolves who had nowhere else to turn. Reforms in how packs were governed had been implemented with strict oversight to prevent alphas from becoming the kind of petty tyrants Silas Drummond had been. She had done it all with KL at her side, supporting her, advising her, but never overshadowing her. He had made it abundantly clear from the very beginning that she was not a decoration or a figurehead. She was his partner, his equal, his queen in truth as well as in name. The white wolf had become a symbol throughout the territories, a beacon of hope for the hopeless. Wolves from across the continent came to see her, to seek her blessing, to ask for her help. She received them all, from the highest alphas to the lowest omegas, with the same warmth and dignity, because she remembered what it felt like to be cast aside, and she had vowed that no one would ever feel that way in her kingdom again. Strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind. Thinking about the past, Kale murmured, his chin resting on her shoulder. Bryn smiled, leaning back into his familiar warmth. Thinking about the cabin, she admitted, I heard the renovation is finally complete. It is, KL confirmed. We kept the original structure, but added significant improvements. Proper heating, real insulation, a kitchen that actually works, and a bed large enough for two wolves who happen to be roughly the size of small horses. Bryn laughed. We should go back, she said. Visit the place where everything started. We can go whenever you wish, Kale promised. His hands moved from her waist to rest gently on her stomach, which was just beginning to show the small, unmistakable curve of early pregnancy. But we should probably plan the trip soon, before travel becomes too difficult. Bryn covered his hands with hers. The royal physicians are already fussing, she said wryly. They want me to stay in the palace until the pups are born, possibly until they're old enough to vote. Pup, Kale repeated, his voice filled with wonder even after months of knowing. We're going to have pups. We're going to have pups, Bryn confirmed, smiling at his continued amazement. Two of them, according to Dr. Thornton's latest examination. A boy and a girl. Kale's arms tightened around her. A boy and a girl, he whispered. Perfect, absolutely perfect. They might be white wolves, Bryn warned him, though there was no real concern in her voice. Like me. The old prophecies say the moon's chosen passes her gift to her children. Then they'll be the most powerful wolves ever born, Kale said with absolute confidence. With you as their mother and me as their father, they won't stand a chance at being anything less than legendary. Bryn laughed and turned in his arms to face him. I love you, she said, standing on her toes to kiss him. I love you so much it terrifies me sometimes. Kale pulled her closer, deepening the kiss until they were both breathless. I waited 150 years for you, he murmured against her lips. I will love you for another 150, and then another 150 after that, and then another after that. He pulled back and looked into her silver-tinged eyes. You are my heart, Bryn Thornwood, my soul, my everything. And I will spend every single day of my very long life making absolutely certain you never forget it. Bryn felt tears prick at her eyes. Happy tears, the only kind she cried anymore. She thought about the girl she had been just 1 year ago, starving in a rotting cabin, abandoned by everyone who should have loved her, absolutely certain that she was worthless, broken, defective, cursed. If that girl could see her now, a queen, a wife, a mother-to-be, a wolf of unimaginable legendary power, a woman who had changed the laws of an entire continent, who had built shelters and support systems for the abandoned and the lost, a woman who was loved beyond all measure. Come, she said, taking Kael's hand with sudden decisiveness. Let's go for a run. Now, Kael asked, surprised. It's snowing. Bryn smiled, and there was something wild in her eyes, something ancient and free. I know. It reminds me of the night we met. She led him out of the royal chambers, down through the palace, and out into the winter night. The guards at every door bowed deeply as they passed, but Bryn barely noticed. She was already shedding her gown, already feeling her wolf rising eagerly to the surface. The transformation was effortless now, as natural as breathing. A thought, a breath, and she was wolf. White as moonlight, bright as hope, utterly, completely free. Kael shifted beside her, his black form materializing like a shadow given solid substance. They looked at each other. Ancient amber eyes met silver ones that glowed in the darkness. And then they ran, out across the palace grounds, leaving tracks in the freshened snow, through the ancient forest that surrounded the city, where the trees stood like silent sentinels, up into the mountains where the snow fell thick and the world was hushed and still. They ran side by side, perfectly matched, perfectly synchronized. Two halves of a whole, finally and forever complete. Far below in the city, wolves looked up from their evening activities to see two shapes racing across the mountainside. One black as midnight, one white as snow, moving together in perfect harmony. The Alphaking and the White Wolf Queen, the stuff of legend. The cabin still stood on its mountainside in Montana, completely restored now, but still keeping its original bones. Bryn had insisted on that. A bronze plaque had been mounted beside the new door, its words simple but meaningful, where kindness changed a kingdom. Bryn visited every winter now on the anniversary of that frozen night. She would stand on the weathered porch, touch the worn wood of the original doorframe, and remember. The cold, the hunger, the absolute despair, and the choice that had changed everything. Her children would grow up hearing the story, how their mother had been thrown away by the world, how she had saved 11 strangers in a blizzard with nothing but her bare hands and her stubborn refusal to let them die, how she had found a king and a wolf and herself in the process. It was a good story, the kind worth telling around fires on winter nights, the kind worth remembering for generations to come. Bryn had saved the wolves, but in the end the wolves had saved her right back. And somewhere in the heavens, the moon goddess smiled down at her chosen daughter and the king who loved her. It was, she decided, exactly as it should be, exactly as it had always been meant to be.